Husserl Ideas 1, Chapter 2, titled Consciousness and Natural Actuality, follows right after his section where he introduces the epoche and explains the natural attitude and its relation to the epoche. And this second chapter is really about consciousness as a natural actuality and consciousness in relation to the way natural actuality shows up, the way that it appears to us. After we achieve the phenomenological reduction, we will have a new appearance of consciousness and of the world, and both will appear as natural actualities. After the phenomenological reduction, we no longer encounter facts, but instead essences. And so it is not that the world is gone in the phenomenological reduction. It's not that we have turned into pure subjectivity and lost the world. No, instead, the world is still there, but only as an essence. Reality whose appearance has a certain invariable structure. As we attend to the world, there's a certain way in which our consciousness attends to the world, and there's a certain way in which the world appears to us, through profiles, incompletely, with horizons, as a transcendent object. So in the phenomenological reduction, the world appears in its mode of appearing, not in its facts or in the relation between those facts. And in the phenomenological reduction, we find a set of other essences as well, such as consciousness. And here's what he says in section 33. We need a certain general discernment of the essence of consciousness as such, and especially of consciousness insofar as, in itself and in keeping with its essence, one is conscious of natural actuality. In these studies, we go as far as is necessary to achieve the targeted insight, namely the insight that consciousness in itself has a being of its own that is not affected in its own absolute essence by the phenomenological suspension. And what he's saying here is not so crazy and unreasonable as it maybe appears. He's saying that the phenomenological reduction, which again is a modification of consciousness, has some essential relation to consciousness in general. And while the phenomenological reduction is a modification of our consciousness, it is also consciousness remaining what it is from the start to the finish. And on the other hand, the phenomenological reduction alters the appearance of the world. It changes the way that the world appears by suspending the natural attitude which was shaping the way that the world appeared. The essence of the natural world undergoes a radical modification, while the essence of consciousness does not. We are still consciously aware in the natural attitude. We are consciously aware in the phenomenological reduction. And he uses this weird phrase that it is the residuum, the residue left after the phenomenological reduction. And then in section 34, he goes on to look at the essence of consciousness as the theme. He announces that these descriptions are going to be untroubled by the epoche. They are from the natural standpoint and are meant to prove that consciousness is its own being with its own essence. The essence of consciousness appears in the fullness of its concreteness and as the stream of experience apprehended intuitively. And while this arises within psychological descriptions, commentators since Paul Ricoeur and many others have remarked that it's ambiguous whether Husserl remains strictly at this level of psychological description, freed and untroubled by the epoche. He, in fact, seems to rise at least to the edge of a phenomenological description, at least by section 35, if not throughout the entirety of these sections. He brings in Descartes with the I think, the Cogito, and says that, for Descartes, actually, the Cogito was not just thinking, and maybe he goes too much in that direction or is also read too much in that direction, but Descartes plainly says that the Cogito encompasses everything from I perceive, I remember, I imagine, I judge, I feel, I desire, I want. And Husserl says, and thus every similar kind of experience of the ego in the midst of innumerable, fleeting, particular formations. So Husserl is going to argue that, consciousness is a natural actuality. It is a real thing that we need to deal with and think about and understand. And it's almost as if, people will say this kind of conservative dad, like, oh, if you drive a car but you don't understand how it works kind of attitude. Well, forget about that. But metaphorically, this is what Husserl is saying. You have consciousness, it's doing something, and we haven't actually figured out what's under the hood. And in order to understand consciousness, he starts with the widest possible sense, and he says that there is an entire fullness of the concreteness of consciousness with the richness of its concrete connections, which is a stream of experience. And the moments in this experience fuse together through their own essence. The essence of consciousness, then, in this general, most wide and full sense, is the concrete continuity of our stream of experience, which is apprehended intuitively and immediately within that flow. So what is it that is always there when we're experiencing, right? What is the invariant? Well, it is the intuitive stream of experience itself. It's the unity of the manifold, the synthesis of the many in one experience. So let's take a look at what Husserl himself has to say. Section 33. Preview of the pure or transcendental consciousness as the phenomenological residuum. We've come to understand the sense of the phenomenological epoche, but in no way what it is capable of achieving. Above all, it is not clear to what extent, actually, with the just given delimitations of the entire sphere of the epoche, a limitation of its universality is given. What can remain if the entire world, including ourselves, with every cogitare, is suspended? Since the reader already knows that the interest dominating these meditations concerns a new eidetics, he will at first expect that the world, as a fact, falls prey to the suspension, but not the world as eidos, and similarly, not any other sphere of essences. Indeed, the suspension of the world does not actually mean the suspension of the number series, distinctiveness, and that, like every authentic region, is a region of individual being. The observations that follow will teach what that means in more detail. Let us first proceed in a way that directly identifies the being in question. And since the being to be identified is nothing other than what we will designate, for essential reasons, as pure experiences, pure consciousness, with its pure correlates of consciousness on one side, and its pure ego on the other. Let us consider it starting from the I, from the consciousness, the experiences that are given to us in the natural attitude. I, the actual human being, a real object like others in the natural world. I carry out cogitationes, acts of consciousness, in the wider and narrower sense. And these acts belonging to this human subject are occurrences of the same natural actuality. Something similar holds for all my other experiences, out of whose changing stream the specific acts of the ego come to light in such a particular way, passing over into one another, combining into syntheses, ceaselessly modifying themselves. In the widest sense of the term, the expression consciousness, but then, to be sure, less suitably, covers all experiences. When we are in the natural attitude, as we are, even in our scientific thinking, due to habits that are most entrenched because they have never misled, we take all these advanced findings of psychological reflection as real occurrences in the world, precisely as experiences of animal beings. It is so natural for us to see them only as such, and not, having become acquainted with the possibility of an altered attitude and in the search for a new domain of objects, we may even notice that it is these spheres of experience themselves from which the new domain arises through the new attitude. Indeed, this is linked to the fact that instead of keeping our sights on this sphere, we turned away from it and sought the new objects in the ontological realms of arithmetic, geometry, and the like, whereby, of course, nothing genuinely new would be gained. Hence, we will keep our sights focused firmly on the sphere of consciousness and study what we find immanently in it. First, before implementing the phenomenological suspension of judgment, we will submit it to a systematic analysis of its essence, albeit in no way an exhaustive analysis. What we need is a certain general discernment of the essence of consciousness as such, and especially of consciousness insofar as, in it itself, and in keeping with its essence, one is conscious of natural actuality. In these studies, we go as far as is necessary to achieve the targeted insight, namely, the insight that consciousness in itself has a being of its own that is not affected in its own absolute essence by the phenomenological suspension. It accordingly remains as a phenomenological residuum, an intrinsically sui generis region of being that can indeed become the field of a new science, phenomenology. Only by means of this insight will the phenomenological epoche deserve its name. The fully conscious implementation of it will prove to be the necessary operation for making pure consciousness, and, as a further consequence, the entire phenomenological region accessible to us. Precisely by means of this, it will become possible to understand why this region and the new science coordinated with it had to remain unfamiliar. In the natural attitude, nothing other than the natural world can be seen at all. As long as the possibility of the phenomenological attitude was not recognized, and as long as the method of apprehending in a originary way the kinds of objects springing up with it was not developed, the phenomenological world had to remain an unfamiliar world, indeed, a world scarcely divined. Regarding our terminology, the following remains to be added. A great deal will be said about pure consciousness. Important motives, grounded in a set of epistemological problems, justify our designation of this consciousness transcendental consciousness as well, and our designation of the operation through which it is acquired as a transcendental epoche. This operation will break down methodologically into various steps of suspension, bracketing, and so our method will assume the character of a step-by-step reduction. Because of this, we will speak, and even speak predominantly, of phenomenological reductions, or we will speak uniformly of the phenomenological reduction with respect to the unity of them all together, and hence too of transcendental reductions from an epistemological viewpoint. Meanwhile, these and all our terms must be understood exclusively in terms of the sense that our presentations mark out for them, but not in any other sense that history or the terminological habits of the reader might suggest. Section 34, the essence of consciousness as theme. Let us begin with a series of observations in which we do not trouble ourselves with any phenomenological epoche. We are directed at the external world in a natural manner and without leaving the natural attitude. We carry out a psychological reflection on our ego and its experiencing. We delve further into the essence of the consciousness of something, just as we would do if we had heard nothing of the new kind of attitude. The very consciousness in which we are conscious, for example, of the existence of material things, bodies, human beings, the existence of technical and literary works, and so forth. We follow our general principle that each individual occurrence has its essence that can be grasped in eidetic purity, and in this purity must belong to a field of possible eidetic research. Accordingly, the general natural factum of the I am, I think, I have a world opposite me, and the like, also has its basic essential content, and we want now to work on this exclusively. Hence, in a way that is illustrative, we can enact singular conscious experience of any sort as they afford themselves in the natural attitude, i.e., as real human facta, or we represent such experiences in memory or in freely fictionalizing fantasy. On the basis of such illustrations that are supposed to be perfectly clear, we apprehend the pure essence that interests us, and we pin them down by forming ideas of them in an adequate way. The singular facta, the facticity of the natural world in general, vanishes from the theoretical focus in the process, just as it does wherever we carry out purely eidetic research. We may circumscribe our theme further. Its heading reads, Consciousness, or more distinctly, Experiences of Consciousness in General, in an extraordinarily wide sense. Fortunately, drawing the exact borders of the latter is not the concern here. Something like that is inappropriate at the beginning of the analysis of the kind that we are carrying out here, but is instead a later result of considerable efforts. As our point of departure, we take consciousness in a sense that is concise and initially affords itself, a sense that we designate most simply by means of the Cartesian cogito, the I think. We are familiar with the fact that it was understood by Descartes so broadly that it encompassed every I perceive, I remember, I imagine, I judge, feel, desire, want, and thus every similar kind of experience of the ego in the midst of innumerable fleeting particular formulations. We will leave out of consideration, and indeed in every sense, the I itself, to which those formations are all related, or that lives in them in very diverse ways. And I, that is active, that undergoes this or that is spontaneous, and that behaves receptively and otherwise in them. Later, it will still occupy us in a fundamental way. For now, quite enough remains to support the analysis and grasp of essences. We will see ourselves immediately referred thereby to extensive connections of experience that compel us to expand the concept of the experience of consciousness beyond the circle of the specific cogitationes. We consider the experiences of consciousness in the entire fullness of the concreteness with which they surface in their concrete connections, the stream of experience, and into which they fuse together through their own essence. It becomes evident then that each experience of the stream, each experience that the focus on reflection is capable of targeting, has an essence of its own that is to be apprehended intuitively, a content that can be considered for itself, in its own distinctiveness. What matters is apprehending this content proper to it. the content of the cogitatio in its own pure distinctiveness, and characterizing it universally, by accordingly excluding everything that does not lie in the cogitatio according to what it is in itself. So too, it is necessary to characterize the unity of consciousness that is required purely by what is proper to the cogitationes and necessarily required, such that they cannot be without this unity.